Doing Grammar, Chapter 3. Some very important terms and concepts are introduced in this chapter, and several of them are likely unfamiliar to you unless you have had previous experience studying grammar. The most important concept for the chapter is status, which describes the tense, modality, and aspect of the verb in a given sentence. Verbs in a sentence can be very simple, one word, past or present, or can be very complex, so it is very important to grasp the concept of status before moving on. This is another example of how the study of grammar is cumulative, where it's really difficult to move on unless you've mastered the current material. So while determining a verb's status can be complex, however, our textbook provides a logical and accessible explanation for why the concepts of tense, modality, and aspect should be treated separately. If you have spent time memorizing verbs in their various tenses, whether in English or another language, you can appreciate how tedious that can be. We learn further that this practice is also not all that useful for understanding how language works. Let's look at the three components that comprise status. First of all, from here on in, we will be referring to and labeling what is called the main verb of a sentence, which can be one or several words. It is the verb and all of its auxiliaries and participles. Secondly, the author of our textbook really beats us over the head with this concept, but it is important to grasp that when we talk about tense, we are talking more about the form of a verb than the actual real-time sense of past, present, and future. You may not have thought about the idea that English has no future tense form before, but it is true for English, German, and other Germanic languages as well. If you have studied French, Spanish, or Latin, you know that these languages have a separate future tense form. The textbook also provides a good explanation of how the forms of a verb that we call tense do not always convey the sense of time that corresponds to that form. The three example sentences on pages 54 and 55 demonstrate this very effectively. And I'll just show you on the screen here the first one. All right, my neighbor walks her dog. Oops, there we go. It's present tense, but describes an ongoing action in past, present, and presumably into the future. It's a regular routine every day. Another sentence is Superman defeats Lex Luthor again and again. It's in present tense, but it's a past idea of comic books from way back in the 50s. And the third one is my plane leaves in 3 hours. It's present tense in form, but is talking about a future action. So if you've had any experience of grammar before, you probably are familiar with the infinitive form of a verb. In traditional grammar, it's typically expressed with to plus that infinitive, or untensed form. We speak of the verb to be, or the verb to play. If you are familiar with it, you may not have thought too much about how this form shows non-finiteness, or how tensed forms of a verb are finite. But this is what is being expressed. Even though all verbs have an infinitive or base form, all sentences must have a finite verb, a verb that shows tense. And this is introduced later in the chapter, but a useful fact is that tense in any sentence is always shown in the first word of a verb phrase. Regarding modality or mood, we use modal auxiliaries in our language to demonstrate the conditional mood, in which verbs express possibility. Semimodals are multi-word verbs that function in the same way as modals. You likely have some experience of other moods in English, what we call indicative, interrogative, or imperative. Because there are relatively few modal auxiliaries, they are not that difficult to identify. As stated in the textbook, when they appear in a sentence, They are always at the beginning of the main verb and are always followed by the infinitive form of the verb. It might seem confusing to think of the tensive modals as being present and past. The difference between shall and should mean almost the same thing. Can and could, etc. And they do not seem to have anything to do with present or past time. But once again, we are talking simply about the form of the verb. The other important concept in the section on conditional mood is that in English and other Germanic languages, we indicate future action with the modal auxiliary will plus the infinitive form of a verb. So will plus the infinitive form shows future tense. The sections on perfect and progressive aspect are pretty self-explanatory. Perfect aspect indicates an action that has been completed and is formed by using a form of the verb have plus the past participle. Progressive indicates an action that is ongoing. Past participles are sometimes more difficult to recognize than present participles because irregular verbs form their past participles in different ways than regular verbs. And sometimes the past participle looks exactly like the past tense form. Present participles are always formed with an ing form of the verb. Progressive aspect is then formed by using a form of the verb be as an auxiliary plus the present participle. The last important concepts in Chapter 3 are A, that verbs in sentences can be complex. They can show conditional mood and perfect and or progressive aspect all at the same time or in any combination. And B, the order of these components of the main verb is always the same. This has nothing to do with rules that are made up by some grammar authority. It simply means that native speakers of English always consistently and automatically form sentences in the same order. It's one of those things about that automatic system that we learn gradually in childhood when we first start using language. The formula on page 69, therefore, is very important. All the components that are in parentheses are optional, but the verb must show tense whether it is in the form of the verb itself or in the first word of the verb string. Let's look at an example of a verb in its most complex form and tense modality and aspect. Looking at the last example sentence on the top of page 66, here is just the main verb of it. Should have been spending. If we are labeling this main verb, we would do it like this. The main verb is past perfect progressive conditional. Wow, that's a mouthful. But also look at how all the required aspects of the verb status are in place. First of all, in conditional mood, it's shown by using a modal, which is in the first position, and it's in past tense, plus the infinitive of have. Okay, so modal plus infinitive form. Then, the perfect aspect is shown in the form of have plus the past participle. So have, which was serving as the infinitive form following the modal previously, now it is the auxiliary for perfect aspect followed by the past participle of the verb be, which is been. Thirdly, we have progressive aspect shown by the form of the verb be, been here, okay, which had been the past participle for the perfect aspect, plus the present participle of the sentence's verb, okay, here. So that's as complicated as a verb string can get, and you won't see that very often, but it is something that you need to be aware of and be looking out for.